Good afternoon. My name is Tyler Fedrizi, and today I'm going to talk to you about Boeing's 737 MAX disaster, specifically the ethical considerations behind why this happened. So to give a quick overview of the 737 MAX, it's the next generation aircraft created by Boeing. It was designed in Seattle, Washington at their main design facility, and the first flight was on January 29, 2016. The core fundamental reason why they designed this aircraft, this new aircraft, was because it has a bigger engine and a better aerodynamic design. This allows the plane to be more fuel efficient and aerodynamic. One of the very interesting components of this new aircraft was something called the Maneuver Characteristics Augmentation System, or MCAS. Now, the MCAS system has been really billed as an anti-stall device. But what an anti-stall device means is that essentially as the aircraft tips forward, like during takeoff, it has a tendency sometimes to tip too far forward. And what can happen is that if not enough airflow is flowing into the engines of the airplane, then the airplane goes into what's called a stall, where the engines shut off, and it can be a very dangerous situation. Now, to measure that, they use something called the angle of attack, which you can see from the second picture on the bottom there, is measured as the angle between how the wind is hitting the bottom of the aircraft relative to where the nose of the aircraft is pointed up. So this is very important, but for the Boeing 737 MAX, it's actually even more important. Because they have bigger engines and they're placed at a different area on the aircraft than the previous generation, this actually caused the 737 MAX to actually tip up during simulation and testing. So they designed this MCAS to essentially try to combat those features. Now, the first tragic event that happened with the 737 MAX aircraft was Lion Air Flight 610 leaving Jakarta, Indonesia. On October 29, 2018, it took off with 189 passengers and then crashed 12 minutes later. It killed all on board. And at first, the reason why this occurred wasn't immediately clear. However, after looking at the black box records and the flight logs, it appeared that the pilots had a really hard time keeping the nose of the aircraft from pointing down into the ground. It wasn't immediately clear at the time, but what the real cause of the issue was that the MCAS system had actually triggered. And I'll talk more about how that happened a little bit later. The second flight that occurred, and really one of the defining moments when people realized that the 737 MAX was actually the problem, was on March 10, 2019 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. That flight took off with 157 passengers, and it crashed after 6 minutes, killing all on board. Again, after reviewing the black box recordings, it was again determined that the pilots were having a really hard time from keeping the aircraft pointing down into the ground because the nose of the aircraft kept going down. So what happened? Well, what they found out after a lengthy investigation was that it was actually a faulty angle of attack, or AOA sensor. And curiously enough, there was only one of these sensors on board, so this is called a singular point of failure for the aircraft, which is highly uncommon in commercial airliners. Another reason was that the MCAS training and details, most of the pilots didn't even know that the MCAS was a system. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is when we talk about the ethical considerations. But essentially, the pilots, especially for the ones from Lion Air's and Ethiopian flights, didn't know that what was actually happening is that because of the faulty AOA sensor, the MCAS system was constantly triggering and they couldn't turn it off. Now, some other factors that contributed to this were really pilot inexperience and something called the lack of airworthiness. And airworthiness is simply a quality where you intuitively understand how your aircraft handles and you're able to cope under pressure. There were also some Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, regulatory failures where they actually allowed Boeing to have regulatory approval for certain aspects of the system, whereas the FAA really should have been the one doing that. So now let's talk about the ethical considerations here, since we have the facts on the ground of what happened. So first, Boeing competes globally against roughly 6 other manufacturers around the world. The main competitor at the time for the Boeing 737 MAX was the Airbus A320neo. It launched in January 14, 2014, which is roughly about 2 years before the 737 MAX. So Boeing was really competing against Airbus and Dreamliner and a number of other aircraft, trying to position themselves as a leader. Now, some of the things that Boeing did, however, where they did know that there were known defects about the MCAS system. People began to question the design, that single point of failure, but no one really spoke up. And really what it turned out after the investigation was that Boeing had a culture of sort of quiet consent, where nobody would speak up about topics and you were really penalized if you did. Furthermore, pilot training on Boeing aircraft is a particular example, and this is a consideration for both Boeing and the airlines, but essentially because of the way that the aircraft flies, if the aircraft flies very differently than a previous generation, you have to train pilots in a very specific way. And this falls into the ethical considerations around the FAA. Now, the FAA is designed to protect people. They're designed to have these regulatory processes to help people, but at the same time, they can't hinder business too much because eventually you do have to let companies just do what they're going to do. So they had a type certification process, and this is what I mentioned with Boeing about how the pilots are trained. If aircraft had the same type certification, then they don't need to be trained across multiple different aircraft. So it's very important for Boeing to have flight characteristics that are very similar to previous aircraft, and that's why they actually created the MCAS system. So it wasn't solely out of ineptitude or some engineering mistake that the MCAS system was designed. It was really designed so that it would be able to meet these type certifications and actually fall within the FAA's regulatory approvals. Now, again, I mentioned that there's a delegation of approval to company employees at Boeing, and that is a huge consideration because Boeing was the one to say yes or no on a number of these design parameters, specifically the MCAS system. And there was really just that lack of oversight and testing, which came out through a 2-year investigation. Now, the third consideration is the airlines. As you can see here on the screen, those are the numbers that you need to actually be certified as a commercial airline pilot. That's not a lot of hours. Right? And budget airlines are even more so because they actually pay less, yet they expect the same level or more service for their customers. And Ethiopian Airlines and Lion Air are both what are considered to be budget airlines. What is most important is that the worst in edge case training is actually very rare. So pilots being put into these really dynamic, highly dynamic situations is actually very rare. And this is all a function of cost. The airlines, these budget airlines, they don't have a lot of money, and they have to figure out the best way to train their pilots, but they can't train everyone for every case. But that's very different from something like the U.S. Navy, which trains their fighter pilots for years, but the U.S. Navy has the budget of the federal government. So that's just another consideration there. So overall, and in my ethical opinion, there were honest and dishonest mistakes. After the investigations, what was found is that Boeing was negligent in design. It was negligent in how it covered up some of what had happened, where it didn't profess that there were mistakes and there were issues and no one really spoke up about it. However, there was no malicious intent to design the MCAS system in such a way that it would fail. The Boeing employees and all of the designers really believed that system would never really be activated. They never really thought that would be the case. Now, at the end of the day, Boeing is ultimately responsible because they made the engineering decisions to do that. There was go-to-market pressure, and the pressure for profit really led them to make some of these decisions, especially like, why was there only one sensor? The single point of failure, I think, in my opinion, is the greatest ethical dilemma. And at the end of the day, their culture of conformity really caused this to happen. Had someone actually said, no, this is a bad idea and stopped this from happening, I believe that these situations maybe wouldn't have occurred. Now, the regulatory body and the airlines are also at play. Airlines can't push their pilots as hard. They need to get them better training, and the FAA has to do its job. So overall, and in summary, 376 people died. Death was a real occurrence, and I think as engineers, all of us have to understand that we have a responsibility to speak up, that engineering design is absolutely critical, and that you must get it right regardless of how long it takes. And that profit cannot be the sole motivation for the design. As I said before, the MCAS system was not solely built just for profit with only one sensor. They really believed it wasn't really necessary until that it was, and then until it killed 376 people. So regulators, the company, and everyone involved must step up into the future to make that happen. Thank you.